Okay, great. Thank you everyone for taking the time to join us tonight. As John was just commenting a few minutes ago, there's a lot of good data out there now. It's been being generated both at Iowa State and other places relative to nutritional strategies to manage pigs and to slow the growth rate when dealing with pork market disruptions. As many of you know, we did a webinar a few weeks ago where John and Laura talked about quite a few different strategies that could be utilized, and Nick Gabler had also initiated a research trial, and we shared some of the initial data from that, and then we have also posted those data as they were continued to be generated. And so really what we wanted to do tonight is to share with you where we're at from a research perspective at Iowa State. One of the other things that we've gotten requests for, in addition to more information on those diets and on those research trials, we also have gotten requests for what's working for other producers. What are producers using? What are they implementing that's working for them? And so fortunately, we've had some great feedback from different producers. Mark Bertram, Al Wolfkuhl, Trey Kellner with AMVC have all shared data back with John, Laura, Nick, and I, and have agreed to let John and Laura and Nick go through some of that information to share for the industry's awareness, so that everyone has all the tools in their tool belt that they can use to continue managing their enterprise in the face of the situation where we're behind on packing capacity as we are. So just want to start from the beginning, thanking everyone that's contributed to that data set and those resources on behalf of the entire industry. Again, as I mentioned, Nick had started this project. He's expanded that to another project that we're excited for him to share some of that data. We'll continue to go through that. John will then share some of the information, and Laura, that's been provided from the industry. And as you all have questions, if you have questions, please just drop those in the comment in the chat box to the panelists. And if there's time, we'll try to address those to the best of our ability. The other thing I would also ask is if you are doing something in your operation enterprise that you think has been useful, share that back to the group of panelists, and we can continue to help deliver that information that's working for producers. So we're always in the information sharing mode, but we're also in the information seeking mode as well. So with that, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Nick Gabler, who's been spearheading a lot of this research, and Nick, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Jason. So can you hear me? All right. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this webinar. So Jason and the team here have asked me to give an overview of some of our research that we've been conducting for the last probably 6-7 weeks. The first 2 weeks of this particular study that I'm going to get into was presented at the last webinar that Jason hosted, but I'll go through some of the other stuff. But really, just a quick recap on the study. So probably about 7 weeks ago now, we started a little, we'll call it a pilot study, really to look at the nutritional approaches to reduce growth rates and feed intake in finishing pigs. And really with that study, we had 2 main objectives. One was to evaluate and provide data to the industry that then which you guys could all utilize to look at nutritional approaches to reduce growth rates or slow down pig growth. And we decided just to do it for about 28 days. And with that, we wanted our nutritional diet formulations to be practical and easy to implement. And also we wanted to be mindful of welfare considerations. So we avoided to do anything with feed restriction and water restriction or feeding every other day, etc. Then the second part of this study, and this is new data that we haven't shared with anyone yet, is that after the 28-day period, we want to evaluate any potential compensatory growth responses for 14 days, for about 2 weeks after we've actually initiated our nutritional growth restriction approaches. And so I'll just share some quick or some data from this particular study. As we've said when we've been releasing these updates weekly, this is an ongoing project. We're still looking at better ways to analyze the data. So all the data that's presented here is really still somewhat in its raw form. But really, the whole idea is to provide everyone with some tools and some ideas where they could potentially go within each of your operations and business models with regard to nutritional strategies. So just a quick recap. I will not go into the details of the diets. They're posted on our website at the IPIC, and John and Laura went through them in more extensive detail a few weeks ago. But really, with this study, we started off with 160, 170 pound pigs, and then with that, we allocated these pigs. We only had 46 barrows and gilts to choose from. We allocated them across 8 different diets. And with those 8 diets, we had really 3 nutritional strategies that we wanted to explore. The first strategy was just increasing the neutral detergent fiber concentration of the diet using soy hulls. So we went from about a control diet of about 9% NDF up to 25% NDF in diet number 4 there, and then that equated to about a 32% inclusion rate of soy hulls. The second dietary strategy was to look at a lysine reduction strategy, and we want to do this in a very simple manner. So what we did with diet number 5 there, we actually just pulled the soybean meal out of the control diet, and so therefore that diet really had no soybean meal and no synthetic amino acids. And then diet number 6 was a halfway or mix between the control diet and diet number 5. And so we end up with a 97% corn diet and an 89% corn diet. And then our third strategy was to explore the use of anhydrous calcium chloride. And we use that at either 4% or 2% of the diet. And so, again, on the website, on our weekly updates, list version 4 is the latest one. All those diets are public or free to the public and can be looked at in more detail. So if we get into the results of this, at least this first part, the first objective of this study, this is just our 28-day body weights. And really, looking at neutral detergent fiber, in the first 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or 2 to 3 weeks, we didn't see a big change in actual body weights over those periods of time as we increased NDF concentrations from 9% the control diet up to 25%. And then these are only on small number of pigs per treatment on 5 or 6, but we do see it by day 28. We are starting to get a linear relationship or a linear decrease in body weights as NDF concentrations increase. And if we break that down, just weekly looking at average daily gain, average daily feed intake, statistically we don't really see any differences with average daily gain, average daily feed intake, and gain to feed in weeks 1, 2, 3, or 4 as we increase fiber. But I think if we actually increase the duration of this project longer with our NDF diets, and also we had it in group pen situations, we may get a different response. And also if we increase the number of pigs per treatment. One thing I'd like to note, and we've been very transparent with our data sets, is that in week 4, on day 22 to 28, these pigs all got infected or naturally infected or broke with swine influenza. And that's evident with the control pigs, with their average daily gains dropping from about 3 pounds a day down to about 1.7 pounds in that 4th week. And so we've got to just bear in mind that in that week 4, we did have a health challenge in these pigs. And that's one thing that was highlighted with this data, is that the 25% NDF pigs actually did quite poor with average daily gain due to the high amount of NDF in the diet. Looking at our lysine reduction strategies, again, we've got body weights from 0 to 28 days, just presented here in this table, and we've got corn, and we've got the control diet in the 2nd column, then the third and 4th column across from the left, we have a 97% corn diet and an 89% corn diet. And really what we're seeing here is that within the first 7 days, switching the pigs from a controlled diet to with adequate lysine to a 97% corn diet, we're starting to see a significant difference in body weights at day 7, and that's maintained all the way through for 28 days. Where our 89% corn diet, we really don't see any difference, any statistical difference from our control pigs, looking at absolute body weights here. Looking at the LS means of the corn, or of the lethal lysine restriction diets that we used, again, it's just is really reflective of what we saw in the body weights. In the first week, we see a significant reduction in average daily gain due to the 97% corn diet. We're going from about nearly 3 pounds a day of growth down to about 0.75 pounds a day of growth in the first week with that corn diet, where the 89% corn diet was similar to our control pigs. And then as we look at in week 2, we see the same relationship. And then again in week 3, we see the same thing. And then also in week 4, we lose some of the significance of average daily gain due to the corn diets. Again, I think it's confounded a little bit by our influenza challenge. If we look at feed intake across this 4-week period, really the pigs are generally eating the same. If anything, the 97% corn diets, actually, they have a reduction, start having a reduction in feed intake in weeks 2 and weeks 3. And then numerically, you could say in week 4, there was also reduced. And then our feed efficiencies are reflective of the differences in growth rates and feed intake differences. One thing I'd like to just also highlight, I've had a lot of comments about the our feed efficiency and feed conversion ratios in the data sets that we've provided. One thing I'd like to say is that these data are LS means, they're not absolute means, and so the numbers are a little bit different because they've been put through a linear model. In other words, if you divide average daily gain by average daily feed intake, the numbers are going to be slightly different than if you just use the absolute mean for average daily gain and average daily feed intake. And then that's due also with our feed conversion ratios, and I'll present that a little bit later on. A lot of the treatments, is a large variation in, large standard deviation actually in the feed conversion ratios between our pigs, and so the numbers are quite high. If we look at the calcium chloride, our third strategy, so that's either using a 2% or a 4% anhydrous calcium chloride inclusion rate in these diets compared to the control. By far, this was the most significant with regard to 28-day body weight differences in pounds. We're talking about a 20% difference between the 4% calcium chloride at day 28 versus the control pigs. So we're up to, what's that, about 45 pounds difference in body weights, compared to about a 6% difference between the 2% calcium chloride and the control pigs. But we see this difference with the use of calcium chloride really in body weights happen in the first week onwards. So first week, second week, third week, we see these differences really appearing in actually slowing down absolute body weight here. This is reflective actually in our average daily gain data. You can really see in the first week, the 4% calcium chloride inclusion rate really put the brakes on the average daily gain of these pigs. So we went from about a 2.86 average daily gain in the controlled group down to a minus 0.36 pounds of average daily gain in the 4% calcium chloride. This was reflective with about a 40-odd% reduction in feed intake in the first week. And then in weeks 2 and 3, we also see a significant reduction in average daily gain in these pigs and also feed intake in these pigs. But really the first week was the most significant reduction. Then the pigs appeared to be acclimating a little bit to the calcium chloride as they stay longer and longer on that diet. But but yeah, definitely a day in week 3, there's still a significant reduction in average daily gain. It's really putting the brakes on growth rates and feed intake within these pigs. And so I like this graph. I think this really illustrates the differences in body weight changes over time. So what this graph is showing is that the delta body weights from day 0. And so each day or each week we plotted the delta gain from the start weight and then presented it here. And really what this data is illustrating is that over the 28-day period, our 4% calcium chloride, which is the blue dashed line at the very bottom, these pigs gained just under 20 pounds over 28 days. So that treatment did a really good job of slowing growth rates. And then the next best treatment was our 97% corn diet, which is really a lysine deficient diet. And then those pigs only gained 30 pounds over that 28-day period. And then we can start to see the 25% start reducing the actual growth or delta growth rates of these pigs. So those pigs gained about 50 pounds, and then everything else was between the control, which gained 70 pounds over 28 days. But really, the calcium chloride pigs, in the first 7 days, they lost body weight. Then by day 14, they were maintaining their body weight. And then really by day 21 to day 28, they were gaining a little bit of body weight over this period of time. And so this data here is also reflective if we look at average daily gain and feed intake over the 28-day test period. So again, we're only dealing with 5 or 6 pigs per pen, but really this is the 97% corn pigs and the 4% calcium chloride pigs really had a significant reduction in average daily gain over this test period, even in the face of a influenza challenge in that 4th week. So the 97% diet, there was about a 57% reduction in average daily gain and a 13% reduction in feed intake over this 4-week period. But that wasn't as good as what we achieved with 4% calcium chloride. So with 4% calcium chloride in the diet, we had a 75% reduction in average daily gain and about a 51% reduction in average daily feed intake. And then the other diets were all intermediate between the control pigs and really the 97% corn diet. The 89% corn diet, which was a little bit less severe in its lysine and amino acid restriction, also reduced average daily gain, but it wasn't significant. But it just shows the importance of amino acids really in growth rates. And then again, a high inclusion of NDF, 25% in NDF, numerically reduced growth rates as well. And that's been well established in the literature. The other thing that we did, Jason organized people from the Iowa Pork Industry Center to come up and ultrasound our pigs. So thanks Matt Ramoja and Colin for doing that, or Colin Johnson. So we want to know, over 28 days, were we having an impact on 10th rib back fat or loin eye area in these pigs? And then really what our limited number, but our data is telling us is that of these pigs that we ultrasounded, our 97% corn pigs, we were not changing their back fat or their 10th rib back fat at all. The 4% calcium chloride pigs had numerically lower back fat, but there really was no difference amongst our treatments with regard to back fat depth as measured by ultrasound at day 28. Looking at loin eye areas were significantly lower than the control pigs for our 97% corn diet and our 4% calcium chloride diet. So about 20% reduction there in loin eye area. But really what we want to really see here is if we actually do a regression of loin eye area versus body weight gain, the data that we see that the calcium chloride, 4% calcium chloride pigs and also the 97% corn pigs are going to be more to the left of this diet. So these are smaller body weight pigs, and as such, the smaller body weight pig just has a smaller loin eye area. There's quite a nice linear regression here. So we're not really limiting or reducing loin eye area as a percentage of body weight, really it's equal to the body weight differences in our pigs. In other words, a smaller body weight pig has a smaller loin eye area. And so these strategies at the moment, from what we're seeing, aren't really having aren't negatively impacting loin eye area if we look at it relative to body weight size differences. And so with that, John, I'll pass it over to you to talk about daily nutrient intakes.
Great, thanks very much, Nick. And if you could move to the next slide, please. One of the questions that has come up during the course of this whole move to develop holding diets and reducing feed intake is, well, if we're reducing feed intake, are we inadvertently creating a deficiency in important nutrients in the pig's diet? So, for example, calcium and phosphorus, which would be related to skeletal development. So we went through using Nick's data and looked at daily intake of ME, of lysine, of calcium and phosphorus. And we looked at it in two different ways. First off, and in this slide, we looked at daily intake of the nutrients. And we looked at it from a daily point of view because for many nutrients, for example, lysine and energy, about a third of the intake per day in a normal growing pig and a normally fed pig, about a third of the intake would be devoted to maintenance requirements. And maintenance is calculated on a daily basis, which is different than the requirement that would be required for growth. So we looked at these nutrients first on a daily intake basis, and you can see the results here. The left-hand column, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse or not, but you can, we put the NRC, I use requirement in quotes because NRC doesn't really provide us with an energy requirement. It provides what the energy would be if you formulated a diet based on corn and soybean meal and fed the nutrient levels that they are proposing. But if that was the case, the pigs would be eating 8.3 megacals of ME per day at this body weight. And you can see when you look at the control diet, the control pigs were eating 10.9 megacals of energy per day. Now remember, these pigs are housed individually, and this is massive appetite. We would see in commercial production, we would see energy intakes that are more in the range of maybe 6.5 to 8 megacals per day, maybe 8.5. If a pig's eating 9 megacals in commercial circumstance, that is a big intake. So you can see that energy intake goes down with the increase in fiber. It obviously went down with the high corn diet. It obviously went way down with the calcium chloride diet. So, I mean, that was to be expected. And in fact, that's what the objective was, to slow down growth. And when we look at lysine daily intake, again, the intake is very high, 25 grams per day, because these pigs were eating so very, very well. And as a consequence, some of these pigs were on lower feed intake, but they were still consuming well above their requirement for lysine. And the exceptions, as you can see with lysine, is the 97% corn diet, the 89% corn diet slightly, and the 4% calcium chloride diet. Now, our bigger concerns were calcium and phosphorus. We wanted and expected energy and amino acid intake to go down to restrict growth, but calcium and phosphorus, we did not want to, we wanted it to at least stay at requirement. And the daily intake for calcium for pigs of this size would be about 13 grams a day. And as you go across, all the way across, there was no pig on any treatment that was consuming less than that requirement for either calcium or phosphorus. So in the context of our experiment, this was not an issue. However, individually housed pigs, big intake, we're going to need to repeat these calculations when we get more information from other experiments that are being done in commercial circumstances to see what's going on. And so we would caution people who are formulating diets to get a sense of what's going to happen to feed intake with whatever strategy you're using, and then make appropriate adjustments so that calcium and phosphorus requirements and other requirements that are needed are met. If we go to the next slide, we can take a look at the intake expressed per kilogram of gain. So remember when we were talking intake per day, that helps us to look at really more on the maintenance side of the requirement. Now, when we're expressing it per unit of body weight gain, that brings in the requirement that is needed for gain. And for example, if we wanted to define the phosphorus requirement, for example, if we're modeling, we can define the phosphorus requirement quite accurately as a proportion to lean body gain. So as you can see, let's focus on calcium and phosphorus. The requirement, daily requirement, according to NRC, would be 14.2, and all of these pigs were consuming above that requirement, and similarly for phosphorus. And what's key here, and what's important, and we need to get our head around this because we need to look at it both from a grams per day point of view and a grams per megacal of gain. But the pigs, for example, on the 4% calcium chloride, their intake was lower, but they're gaining so slowly that their amount of calcium and phosphorus they were getting per unit of gain was actually quite high. So I'd like to turn it over now to Laura, to Dr. Greiner. And Laura, do you have any further thoughts on this whole issue of essential nutrient intake?
Yeah, thanks, John. I appreciate the question. You know, I think John's hit the nail on the head. You know, this is a great study and it's a great start as we look out at some of the other studies that we'll talk about tonight, as well as some of the other work that maybe some of you are doing. There are some other factors that we need to take into account, such as crowding in the pens, feeder space, whether or not barn temperatures are being influenced that could also potentially be reducing intake. But the point here that John and Nick are trying to communicate is very valid, that when formulating correctly and accounting for the feed intake differences, we should be able to comfortably meet our calcium and phosphorus needs, so not to worry about leg issues, particularly as we do get those pigs to market at some point. We had discussed in the past as well concerns about potassium. Our group corrected our calculation error and addressed that question in one of our handouts, that potassium really isn't an issue because corn is adequate for the pigs' needs for this part of their production phase. One of the other questions that we tend to get a lot will be around trace minerals and vitamins. And are we going to have any issues, particularly with things like calcium chloride diets, when we have such a reduction in intake? And it's really important to go back and look in the literature. I did so today, and very easily I found 3 studies that all show that you can remove trace minerals and vitamins for at least 28 days, if not longer, and not have impacts on carcass data or growth data. Maybe a slight suppression in average daily feed, but again, as we set these diets up, we can safely put those out to our barns and not worry, if these are only for a month's time, to have any negative implications on growth. Nick, one of the questions that I've had received a couple of times, and even in my own experience, was we had a producer, for example, that had pigs on the 97% corn diet, that got the all clear from the packing house that they could go ahead and move pigs back in. And so they've moved the pigs back onto their standard program. And so what can we expect when we bring those pigs back onto a standard program in terms of growth? I know you did some work on that, so would you mind sharing that now on that growth period after we put them back on a normal program?
Yeah, no problem, Laura. So as I said, one of our second objectives was to evaluate if there's any compensatory gain with our small subset of pigs. So we had them on we'll call it on our growth restriction diets for 28 days. And then we're about to pull them all off, and then I was talking to John, Laura, and Jason, and one of the things was, well, what if you got the bottom end of the barn that's still there, and you need to get more weight on them? Can we actually do something to actually get more weight on these pigs? So what we ended up doing with our 46 pigs, we put them all back on our control diet. So our control diet was about a 0.77% SID lysine. And then we monitored them just for 2 weeks. And so the plan was can we actually see any compensatory gain? And then again, this is this figure here, or this, this figure here really just highlights the fact that, I can get my laser pointer to work. Where are we? And no, sorry, a second. This highlights the fact here that at this line here at week 4, 28 days, everything went back on the control diet. So our control diet here in the black dashed line at the very top here, these pigs over that 42-day period were gaining about 110 pounds. And then they kept on the same trajectory with their growth curve. You can see in that week 3 to week 4 period, there's quite a few of the lines were flattening out. That's where we had the influenza issues. But with our 4% calcium chloride pigs, in the 2 weeks after we switched them back, these pigs gained about 60 pounds of body weight. And I'll get into that in a minute when I look at when we talk about average daily gains. We also see that the 97% corn pigs, they gained about going from about 30 pounds up to 80 pounds, so about 50 pounds of gain over that 2-week period. And so if we look at this as an average daily gain, what we're seeing over this 2-week period here is that our pigs, switching them back to a normal diet with adequate lysine and essential amino acids, we see we can get these pigs up to about 240, 250 pounds in 2 weeks from where they were the previous below 200 pounds 2 weeks earlier. This is reflective in average daily gain, in which our 4% calcium chloride pigs were gaining 4.25 pounds a day. These pigs as a whole had a really large appetite. In other words, they're eating up around 9 to 10 pounds a day. These are large numbers, but as John alluded to, some of these numbers are associated actually with the fact that these are individually penned pigs. And the other thing is that in this 2 weeks post the diet intervention, these pigs were also rebounding from a influenza. And I've seen this in my other disease research that we've done in more controlled settings, that once the pigs recover, some pigs do have a compensatory gain, in the sense they will try and eat more to catch up from where they were due to that health incident that happened in the previous weeks. But a lot of the gain associated with the 4% calcium chloride, we've got to be careful of what that gain is. A lot of it is actually associated with gut fill and also increased water retention within those pigs. So it's not all lean gain or body weight gain per se. A lot of it is going to be associated with gut fill. We're still at a 0.6 pound better average daily gain with our 97% corn pigs compared to the 3 pounds in our control pigs. And then our NDF diets from 15 to 25%, these pigs were all lower than our actual control pigs with regard to average daily gain over this 2-week period. And that was probably expected, because if you're switching pigs from a high fiber diet back to a high starch diet, we've changed the microbiota, we've changed their digestibility and metabolism, and now all of a sudden we put them back on a more concentrate diet, then these pigs are probably just struggling. But if we gave another week or so, they probably would have reverted back to have similar average daily gains as the control pigs. So really the take-home message from what we're seeing so far, and again, this is small numbers, is that if you got your bottom end of the barn that's still left, or if the opportunity opens up where you can market more pigs, you can put them back onto an adequate lysine diet, an adequate control diet, and then we should be able to recapture some of the slowed growth that we've actually put on these pigs, in whether it's in the first week or even in the second week. So there is opportunity there. Now, this may be dependent, maybe different in group pen situations. It also could be different with different genetics, and that needs to be probably evaluated better in the industry. But it's just some interesting data that we've got out of this study. The other thing that we received a lot of questions about 6 weeks ago when we did, or 4 weeks ago when we did the first webinar, was what was going to happen in group pen situations. All the data that we've been generating has been pretty much on the fly with individual pigs, small numbers, individual pen data, etc. So what our group has done in collaboration with New Fashion Pork, and Chad has that up there, and also with Triumph Foods, is that we want to evaluate nutritional approaches in a more commercial environment. And so there was 3 key objectives, or 3 main objectives to this study, and today I'm just going to present a little bit of the preliminary data that we have out of this study. It's going to be probably about a 6-week study, 5-6 week study. But really the 3 objectives were similar to what we did in our first study, which was to really evaluate different nutritional strategies to slow pig growth rates in a pen situation. The other thing is we've had a lot of inquiries about pig vices. Do we have any negative behaviors that develop if we are growth restricting pigs? And so part of this study, we've been weekly evaluating pig vices such as tail biting, aggression, and etc. Then the third part, which we don't have any data to release today, but we hopefully will in the next couple of weeks, is we're interested in how does some of our different dietary programs, how are they impacting both carcass quality or yields and also pork quality. So we're in the process of getting carcass and pork loins out of these pigs, and then we're going to evaluate that. And then when we have some of that data, like we've been doing, we're going to release that as fast as we can get it within reason. So the diets that we implemented with New Fashion up there with Chad is really we had 6 diets, so we used roughly 900 late finishing pigs. These pigs were literally 275 pounds when we started the project. They were mixed sex. We had 48 pens, 18 pigs per pen, and we're roughly doing about 8 pens per diet. And our diets that we utilized pretty much based off our earlier study that I just presented, and also just some work that that Chad's interested in. So what we had was we had a control diet. We had a 15% and 20% neutral detergent fiber diet, which is pretty much driven by soy hulls inclusion. We wanted to see how our 97% corn, or our low lysine diet, worked. So that was pretty much the same diet that a very similar diet to what we had in our first study. And then we also had a 3% calcium chloride or anhydrous calcium chloride diet. And then diet number 5 there, sorry, I went out of order, but diet number 5 was a low branch chain amino acid or an isoleucine diet. So we tried to generate a diet that would result in some branch chain, we'll say, whether it's deficiencies or reductions within that diet formulation. And so that's referred to as the ISO diet. And so one thing I'd like to report, and I think this has been backed up by what we're hearing out in the industry, is that over the first 3 weeks of these dietary strategies implemented in group pen situations, based off the scoring that's been done, we are seeing no incidences of tail biting, ear biting, aggression, lameness, anemia associated with any of our dietary strategies. We have a very low percentage of pigs that have any signs of tail biting, aggression, etc., and lameness. And so we're still continuing to collect this data, but we're not seeing any negative effects with pig behavior with these dietary strategies in trying to reduce growth rates in a group pen situation. And I think it'd be nice to hear what other people in the industry are actually seeing, but from what I've heard, and I think what John and Laura have heard, and Jason, we're hearing similar stories, maybe a little bit of lameness here or there, but generally speaking, we don't see any negative pig vices in our data set that we can report as of today. If we look at just the body weights of here's just a table just comparing the body weights over the first 3 weeks. But really what we see, I just summarized it quickly, is that based off our data sets, we're seeing the 25% NDF pigs, there's about a 2% reduction in body weight, absolute body weight in these pigs. We got a 5% reduction with our low lysine diet, our corn diet. And then with the 3% calcium chloride results in about a 15% reduction in body weights. And these numbers are actually quite close to what we saw in the individual pigs at Iowa State. And so this data we're still collecting. We are marketing some pigs out of this study every 2 weeks. And so we'll, as I said, we'll share some of that data as we get it. If we look at average daily gain differences and feed intake differences in group pen situation, our average daily gains in week 1 were the most reduced compared to the control pigs in our 97% corn diet, but really the 3% calcium chloride diet put the brakes on average daily gain. Actually, we had a negative average daily gain with these pigs. Now, a lot of that negative average daily gain is probably associated with reduced gut fill and feed intake, and also changes in water retention within that pig. But really, we saw a slight negative reduction in average daily gains in our small individual study with 4% calcium chloride. But when we use 3% anhydrous calcium chloride in a commercial setting in group pen situations, it was a lot more severe. Then again, over time, over the next 2 weeks, in week 2 and week 3, average daily gains are slightly increasing compared to what they were in week 1 with our calcium chloride treatment, but they're still significantly lower than what we are seeing actually compared to our control pigs. The corn diet pigs are also significantly lower than what the control pigs are when we have our lysine deficient diet. So it's kind of backing up what we saw on an individual basis. And then the 25% NDF diet is mainly showing a reduction in feed intake in week 2 and week 1, but that hasn't fully translated to major, or at least significant differences in growth rates and average daily gain in weeks 1 or 2 in these pigs. Overall, we can really see that there's about a 50% reduction in average daily feed intake due to calcium chloride. There is no difference in feed intake with regard to 97% corn diet over the 3-week period, and then we really just have about a really significant reduction really in average daily gain feed intake over this 3-week period. And so really what we're seeing with these diets is that they are somewhat backing up what we saw in an individual pig basis at Iowa State on a very small number. And so we've been encouraged by this, that these are some commercial strategies that could be utilized. But again, this is an ongoing project, and hopefully we can share some carcass and pork quality data and more virus data in the next couple of weeks once we get this project more data collected. And so, John, what else are we seeing in the industry? You got some other data that people have been shared with us or with the team. And so would you like to go through some of that?
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate that. And I just make one comment on the study at New Fashion Pork, and we made one change in diet formulation on the calcium chloride diet, and that is in Nick's study, we took a very conservative route. We, because of the high amount of calcium being added from the calcium chloride, we added a lot of phosphorus to maintain the same calcium to phosphorus ratio, and using monosodium phosphate. That's what JTN did in his study back in the mid 80s. And so that's what we did because in our study, because we did not want calcium phosphorus to be an issue. But in the New Fashion Pork study, we took a different tact. We know the calcium phosphorus ratio is not as important when phosphorus is not close to requirement. And so when Chad formulated the diets, he increased the phosphorus content by 50%. So obviously that adds cost, but he added that extra phosphorus using monocalcium phosphate rather than monosodium phosphate, which saved a lot of money. And we wanted to see how that worked. And as you can see, so far that strategy has been working fairly well. I'd like to turn now to some data that's been shared graciously with us by a number of producers throughout the state. And in this one, AMVC has shared with us some data on carcass. And so thanks to Trey Kellner, their nutritionist, for sharing this. You can see they tried 3 different strategies for slowing down growth. One strategy, they remove fat. One, they reduce their lysine to net energy ratio to 80% of normal. And in the other, they use the corn diet that Nick has been talking about. Good large numbers of animals. It's field data, of course, but the pigs went to market at around the 300-pound range. You can see that there was really no impact on back fat. There was maybe a bit of an increase with the corn diet, but then those pigs are a little bit heavier as well. There was no effect on loin depth at all, no effect on lean yield, and no effect on lean or carcass yield, pardon me, and no effect on lean percent. So really helps to give us confidence that the impact of these feeding strategies on carcass maybe is less of a concern than we thought of originally. Moving then to the next slide, please. These are data that Provimi is working with TDM and hog slat and running a trial. So I said within the state, and my apologies to Provimi because you guys are over in Ohio. But this is a study where it's going to be a 6-week study in total. And they've got 4 different treatments. They've got a control regular feeding program, and then they have the 97% corn diet. So in the treatment number 1, the pigs stay on the control diet for all 6 weeks. In treatment number 2, the pigs will start out on the corn diet, and after 3 weeks, go back onto the control diet, much like Nick was talking about. But in treatment number 3, the pigs will spend the first 3 weeks on the control diet and then switch to the corn diet. And then treatment number 4 will be the pig staying on the corn diet for all 6 weeks of the trial. The data that you see here is just after 2 weeks. We literally just got these data this morning. So thanks very much to the folks at Provimi for sharing this. And I've combined, because for the first 2 weeks, there's really only 2 treatments, the control diet and the 97% corn diet. You can see that they've found or seen a 15-pound reduction in weight at the end of the 2-week period, reduction in average daily gain of about 50%, pretty big hump in feed conversion, but magnitude-wise, not really that much different than what Nick found in his experiment. The cost of the diet per pound of gain is higher on the corn diet because the feed conversion is so poor. But if you were to look at the feeding cost per day, so it depends which is the driving economic factor here on your farm. But if you looked at feed cost per day, the control diet is about 43 cents and the corn diet is about 33 cents. And you can see after 2 weeks, there's really no effect on mortality. Moving on then to the next bit of data. This was shared with us by Al Wolfkuhl of GW Grain and Livestock. Al, if you're listening, I went to Google to find out how to pronounce the name of your town, and they gave me 6 different options. So I'm just going to say that Al farms in Buchanan County in eastern Iowa. But what Al did is he fed basically the corn diet. He tightened up the feeders just a little bit, allowed barn temperature to go up just a little bit, and then he kept track of that particular load of hogs, 167 pigs, and compared that to his year-to-date data. So we know that there's, that's not perfect data, but it's still data that is good to get and put it together with everything else. And once again, we see the same conclusion that there was no real effect on back fat. It was up a little bit. Loin depth was, if anything, was bigger, or was greater, excuse me. The percent lean was basically the same. The yield was maybe a little bit higher in that one load, but remember, it's just one load of pigs, so there's going to be variation there. The grade premium was maybe up a little bit, 75 cents, and there was a bit more sort and weight loss. So yeah, so that gives, we're happy to share, and thanks very much to the companies and individuals that have shared those data with us. We really, really appreciate it. And now I'd like to turn it back to Nick and Laura, if you guys have any further comments on what we're seeing from these commercial trials.
Yeah, so we're other people have shared some data with us as well, and it's quite similar with the corn diet. I know United Animal Health has some similar data sets that's showing that there is some benefits with that type of diet, with trying to at least reduce slow down the pig, reduce average daily gains. One of the things that we have heard with the corn diet is it can be a problem with handling in the bins. It gets held up in the bins and doesn't flow that well because of the smaller particle size. But generally, it seems to be a lot of people seem to be validating what we've shown with our initial study with that.
Great, thanks. Thanks for that, Nick. I'd like to hand over now to Laura. Laura has some data that has been shared with us from Kent Feeds and First Choice Livestock. So Laura.
Okay, so Nick, can you go ahead and advance the slides? Okay, so this is some work that was presented to us from Kent Feeds. Much like what we talked about with the new fashion study looking at amino acid changes with branched chain amino acids, Kent took the approach of looking at a methionine surplus. So this would go back to some work that Edmonds and Baker did many years ago. And what they did here was for about a week's time, they fed either 3360 or 63 pounds per ton of methionine. Based on what they saw that first week, they brought the methionine loads down to 7, 12, or 13 pounds per ton. And they looked at this in both just a control diet, of course, which we would have on the farm, but they did a corn-only diet with a high amount of methionine, or they fed a low-protein diet. So low protein in this situation is about 50% of the typical soybean meal that would be in those diets at that phase. And then they looked, of course, at these two different levels of methionine that you can see down in that table. So Nick, if you can go ahead and advance to the next slide. For that first week, roughly 0 to 6 days, if we look at the control, these pigs were gaining about 1.82 pounds a day. Our corn pigs that we've seen with our 97% corn, we would still expect to have some intake and gain, but with the 60 pounds of methionine added to that diet, we saw a significant reduction in daily gain. We saw similar trends with the low protein, both at the 33 pound and 63 pound per ton, with a significant reduction in cost. Nick, if you could advance to the next slide, please. When you look then at following those animals from day 6 to 14, again, remember in this period, they reduced the amount of additional methionine that they added to the diet based on the responses they were initially seeing. And in doing so, that corn diet that was at 60 pounds that went down to 12 pounds per ton actually has a very similar gain compared to the control. Our pigs that are on the low protein diets that had the higher methionine levels that were lowered actually have a higher amount of daily gain those next 2 weeks. Now, much like what Nick's presented in some of the work, they really believe that this is associated with gut fill that's happening after that first week. Because again, in that first week's data that maybe I didn't point out very well, is that average daily feed intake, particularly on that corn-only diet with the methionine, was significantly lower. So Nick, if you could advance one more slide for me. So this is really what they looked at from day 0 to 14. So again, the first 6 days, they were very aggressive with the methionine. The remaining 8 days, they lowered that methionine, but they still kept it relatively high compared to a typical diet today. And overall, they saw a significant reduction in average daily gain on all of these different diets with the methionine added compared to the control. And here on this slide, you can also see the changes in feed intake, particularly with that corn-only diet with the higher amounts of methionine. Nick, you can go ahead and advance. So Kent did some additional work with this. They looked at a couple of different approaches with the methionine, and they follow these pigs out even further. And you're certainly welcome to communicate with Kent to understand the results. But in the end of it, using the low protein plus the DL methionine resulted in about a 5-pound gain in 10 days, where using a corn diet resulted in a 1.8 pound over 4 days and 9 over 15. So corn plus the higher methionine had the greater amount of reduced performance. Nick, there's one more slide there. So Kent was able to demonstrate through all of that doing something such as DL methionine in addition to a 97% corn diet, or even in addition to something that's a reduced protein diet, does have the potential again to be effective in reducing growth rates and still being a potentially cost-effective approach. So I do want to thank the Kent team there at the bottom for being willing to allow me to visit with all of you tonight on their data and being able to present it. So John, with that, I'm going to turn it back to you for any final comments or discussion points.
Thanks very much for that, Laura, for that information. And just a few final thoughts that we've had overall, sort of taking a look at the total picture. And it would be our impression, but we would welcome comments from those who are listening to us today. But it appears that the corn diet or some variation of that diet, because some people are going to very, very low levels of soybean meal, or going with no soybean meal but synthetics, or there's various permutations of that concept. But that appears to be the most common option that's being used in the industry. It's easy to implement. It's certainly effective, as you've seen today. It sometimes is used, or often even is used, with slight tightening of the feeders and slight elevating of barn temperature to achieve the desired final outcome. We are seeing some operations that are using the calcium chloride approach, and this approach is, in my experience at least, is being used when, due to market conditions, the growth of the pigs has to be really, really slowed down. The pigs really have to be held. And so that seems to be the choice when that kind of significant or dramatic slow in growth is required. The only other comment I don't have on the slide here, then I'm going to pass it back to Nick and to Laura, is the impression I have, and it's only an impression. We don't have the data yet to really support this because, as we've said many times, Nick's study is individually housed pigs, but we are thinking that we might see more variation in body weight at market when we're feeding these diets that reduce feed intake. But I think we'll learn a little bit more about that as we get more data coming in. So with that, thank you so very much to everybody who's participated this evening. Nick and Laura, do you have any further final thoughts that you'd like to add? And if not, then I'll hand it back to Jason, our host.
Yeah, thanks, John. So thank you everyone for listening in. I do think there is opportunity to do something with compensatory gain on the back end, especially on that last dump of the barn. If we've got lightweight pigs in that barn, I think there's opportunity to try and get some more weight back on them, because it's probably not advantageous to have them actually on a growth attenuation diet. And so I think there's some opportunity there, at least to help with the bottom end of the barn, or to actually get weight back on them prior to market, whether it's 1 week or longer. So I think there's some opportunities there for the industry to explore.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment, Nick. As producers are looking forward and getting calls or potentially having opportunities to start marketing barns and start making those elections to go back to standard diets, to be very mindful of that compensatory gain so that they don't potentially drop out of their market weight spot that they need to be in. I think that will be very critical as they make those decisions going forward, that it might be such like we used to do with a Paline step up, where you hold your barn on your holding diet until your barn's half marketed, and then you go ahead and release them into an upper diet to go ahead and get that growth rate. That's all I have. I want to thank the participants as well. Jason, we'll turn it back over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, John, Nick, Laura, for being here. Thank you, Amanda Chipman, for coordinating, getting the WebEx set up and invitations and all the registrations and running all the video. Appreciate that very much. There were a few questions that popped up. I tried to answer some of those. The information, some of those we did have that information, and it's up on the website that's up on the screen now, www.ipic.iastate.edu. This video, once we get it downloaded, will also be posted on our YouTube channel, similar to the last one. So if there's something that you want to go back and find and dig into and re-listen to, that will be available in the near future as well. Again, want to thank, as John and Nick and Laura did throughout, great partnerships throughout the industry that's very much appreciated, just how everyone is willing to contribute, help get answers that are needed in a short amount of time, and the willingness to share that with the entire industry. So big thanks to AMVC, TDM, Hogslat, Provimi, New Fashion Pork, Kent Feeds, and First Choice Livestock, and G&W Pork. So that's all that you saw tonight wouldn't have been possible without without their contributions. Again, this work with Nick's doing with New Fashion Pork is ongoing. Hopefully, as one of the questions in the question box was regarding the carcass quality, we'll be working with our meat scientist team, Doctors Stephen and Elizabeth Lonergan, as well as Dr. Terry Hauser, to look at some of that information as those animals out of that study are harvested. That project, again, the project that Nick has run and the project that is running now with New Fashion Pork is financially supported from the Emergency Research Fund out of the Iowa Pork Industry Center. So with that, I'll see if there's any questions that John or Nick. One of the questions I saw that had popped up was on particle size, coarse grind, or a partial whole corn. Has that been looked at anywhere that you guys are aware of? Has anybody studied that at all in the industry? I think they're all muted. I don't know if anybody's trying to answer, but.
Sorry, Jason. It's John here, and I can't say. We've had experience, obviously, lots of experience with particle size in complete diets, but with just a corn diet, obviously, one would think that the impression I have had with the limited experience I've had with just that is that the problem would be exaggerated with smaller particle size. So if you're going to a straight corn diet, going to a larger particle size might be desired, but you have to balance that off with how you're feeding the rest of your pigs and losing the benefit you get for the whole barn to get that improved flowability in the late finishing period. So it's I think that's why you're being met with silence, because we need a little time to think about that, to say in overall balance what would be the best strategy.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. And I just looked down at the clock too as you were answering that question. I see that we're already 5 minutes past the time frame here. So what we'll do, I know Amanda will download the questions from the group and from the participants, and we can try to get those addressed and get that information back out to the participants as well. We can fire out an email to the group on those questions that weren't able to be answered. The other thing I would add is the email address that's on the screen right now, ipic@iastate.edu. If you send an email question to that, Sherry Hoyer, Amanda, or myself, we can get that directed to the person best suited to answer that question. So again, thank you very much for everyone for your participation. Thank you, doctors, patients, Gabler and Greiner, for your contributions tonight. We could not possibly do what we're doing at Iowa State and on behalf of the industry without the expertise from you three. So it's greatly appreciated. With that, I'll adjourn the meeting. Thanks everyone for being here.